The next several videos in this training will cover the Faxination 2016 host connectors. These connectors support inbound routing of messages to printers, inbound and outbound messaging with .NET Web Services, outbound faxing from multifunctional devices or copiers, inbound and outbound messaging via Microsoft Exchange Server 2007 and later, outbound messaging via a virtual printer, inbound and outbound messaging via SAP Office, inbound routing of messages to local folders or UNC network paths, inbound routing of messages to SharePoint document libraries, inbound and outbound messaging via HL7 healthcare systems, inbound and outbound messaging via REST applications, and host-to-host routing from Exchange or Office 365 mailboxes. This is a new feature for Faxination 2016 that monitors a mailbox and routes file attachments to any inbound capable Faxination host, with no fax or mobile messaging involved. The Faxination Print connector provides for inbound routing of fax and mobile messages to local or shared network printers. This is useful when an organization requires hard copies of communication due to internal policies, industry regulations, or legal requirements. The Faxination service account must have the necessary printer access permissions, and this connector is inbound only. The General and Kernel Contract tabs are common for all of the host connectors, so we'll cover these only once. The connector name is the name used in the connection contract between this connector and the Faxination kernel. Machine is the domain name of the server that is running this connector. And the wake-up port is the UDP port of this host connector. All Faxination host connectors have unique UDP wake-up ports, and this list is available in the Faxination 2016 Administrator's Guide. As with all Faxination host and device connectors, you can specify IP addresses or ranges that are allowed to communicate with this connector. Connection attempts from IP addresses that are outside of these ranges or explicitly blocked will be rejected with no response. On the Kernel Contract tab, first we have the identifier of the kernel that this connector is associated with, the domain name or IP address of the Faxination kernel, the listen port where the Faxination kernel is listening for incoming connector communications. The default non-SSL port is 53080. You have the option to maintain the kernel connection between messages. This improves efficiency in high-volume environments, but should be disabled in load-balanced configurations so that the connector is free to make connections to multiple kernels. You have the option to enable SSL encryption for this connector. Note that SSL must also be enabled on the kernel or load-balanced kernels. And you configure the SSL credentials here when SSL is enabled. On the Messages tab, you may set the interval between checks of the Faxination queue for new messages. The default is 20 seconds. And you can set the path where temporary files are stored as they're passed between the Faxination kernel and this connector. FMF stands for the Fenestre Message Format. On the Text Jobs tab, you can set the margins to use with the destination printer. You can set the font and font size to use when printing text-based messages. And you can enable and disable printing options such as notifications, message details, and page numbers. On the Page Header tab, you can configure the page header data to print on each page of the inbound message, and set the page header font and size. The Faxination Web Service connector provides a programmatic interface for both inbound and outbound fax and mobile messaging. This allows you to create your own custom applications using industry-standard .NET Web Services. You don't need to know how to communicate with a fax card, GSM modem, or mobile service provider. Fenestre has already done that work for you, and there's no need to reinvent the wheel. There are no custom APIs to learn or DLLs to load, but the Faxination Web Service connector does require IIS to be available on the server before the connector is installed. The Registered Servers tab is how we match incoming messages to listening web services that you've created. This is done using the system address of a Faxination user entity. The system address is matched to a URL that you've hosted in your environment. This is what we call server push, meaning that we push the messages and notifications to you as soon as they arrive, rather than your application blindly asking for new messages that may or may not exist. The system address matches a Faxination user entity to an inbound web service URL. You can set the functional level of the web service that we'll be connecting to. This will vary depending on the development environment that was used to build your listening web service. For example, older versions of Microsoft Visual Studio use DIME for binaries, but the latest versions use MTOM. You can choose the method to use when checking to see if an inbound web service is alive. The Web Service Discovery method is the typical way of checking the alive status of a web service based on .NET. The Simple Web Request method is used when the listening web service is not based on .NET. Any response from the web service is considered alive. If your web service requires credentials for access, you can configure those here. On the ISAPI tab, we can set the folder path to use for temporary file storage. And the Directories tab is used to set the path for temporary file storage as messages are passed between the kernel and the connector. Web Service Connector requirements. On the server side, we need Microsoft.NET Framework version 3.5 SP1 and .NET version 4.5. Web Service Extensions 3.0 runtime, and Microsoft Internet Information Server version 6 through 10. IIS 10 is included with Windows 10 and Windows Server 2016. IIS must be available and running during the installation of the Faxination Web Service Connector. On the development side, Microsoft.NET Framework 3.5 SP1 and .NET version 4.5, Web Service Extensions 3.0 Developers version, and Visual Studio.NET 2008, 2010, 2012, 2013, or 2015. The web service send methods. Send fax is plain text only with options for cover sheet, charge code, and so forth. Send simple fax is plain text only with no options. Send fax ATT is plain text plus binary attachments with MTOM encoding and full options. Send SMS is plain text with options for a template, charge code, and so forth. Send simple SMS is plain text only with no options. Send SMS bin is for binary SMS or ringtones, logos, or over-the-air provisioning. Send SMS bin 2 is a special method for large binaries or multiple messages. And send MMS is plain text plus a binary attachment with MTOM encoding with full options. Web service get methods. Get fax ATT is to retrieve fax binary data from the queue with MTOM encoding. Get SMS is to retrieve SMS messages in plain text from the queue. Get notification is to retrieve detailed notification from the queue. Get notification ATT is to retrieve detailed notification plus binary data with MTOM encoding. Get simple notification is to retrieve a simplified notification from the queue. Get status retrieves the job status but does not remove the job from the queue. Get MMS allows you to retrieve an MMS message with plain text and binary with MTOM encoding. And web service receive methods. Receive fax ATT is the server push version of get fax ATT. Receive notification is the server push version of get simple notification. Receive notification ATT is the server push version of get notification ATT. Receive SMS is the server push version of get SMS. And receive MMS is the server push version of get MMS. Here's an example of how you would send an SMS text message via web services. SMS is just simple text, so you don't need to work with binary encoding for file attachments. SResult is a string returned from the web service indicating the receipt, such as OK. S system address is a string specifying the system address of the sending application. From is a complex variable of type fin address, which includes the address, the type, and a friendly name. S number is a string of the recipient's mobile number. S message is a string of the text message to be sent, equal to or less than 160 bytes for a single message. Options is a complex variable type of fin SMS options, which includes priority, charge code, etc. And iJob ID is an integer indicating the job ID assigned by the kernel. Now, although there is some additional encoding required to set the complex variable types and define a user interface if needed, the actual heavy lifting is accomplished with just a single line of code. This is an example of a real-world application that I created for our Fenestre support department. It provides a quick and efficient way of sending outbound test messages when we're working to resolve an issue with a customer. Now, bear in mind that I am not a professional programmer. This is just some very basic code that I came up with when I was teaching myself about the web service connector. The fax number field is the to.address variable. The fax type field can be simple or complex and between 1 and 4 pages. What this really does is select between 8 different cover sheets. The variable finops.reportRequested is set to 3, meaning that we always want a notification of the success or failure of this fax transmission. This single line of code submits the message to the Faxination web service connector. And the list box is populated with the fax number that we sent to, confirmation of the action from the web service connector, and the Faxination job ID. The notifications are written to a UNC file share, and a link to the path is provided in the interface. A common problem that can occur with customers that are using the Faxination web service connector for the first time is notifications piling up in the queue. As we've seen, it's fairly easy to send outbound fax and mobile messages via web services, even for a newbie programmer. But often they have trouble grasping how to handle the resulting notifications. There are actually 3 solutions to this problem. 1. Use a GET method to pull the notification from the queue by referencing the job ID that was passed by the fax server during the send operation. 2. Create your own listening web service with a receive notification function so that the fax server can push notifications to you. And 3. Don't request a notification during the initial send fax call. The trap here is that the send simple methods, which new programmers are tempted to use, have notifications hard-coded and set to always. Instead, use sendfax or sendfax_att with report requested equals 0. Web Service Connector troubleshooting. Ensure that all prerequisites are met: the .NET Framework 3.5 SP1 and 4.5, Web Service Enhancements 3.0, and Visual Studio, etc. Ensure that the C drive temp folder exists on both the server and client machines for temporary storage. This is the default path when you've based your application on the client sample code or the server sample code. Ensure that IIS is properly configured to allow connections from your application and that the default website is running. Check that you can view the WSDL information in your browser. By default, this is the Faxination server name /finmessage.net3/finmessage.asmx. If you've created your own web service application from scratch, compile and test with the sample code provided. Look for your issue on our support site, and trace network traffic with tools like YAT or Wireshark.